Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Situacija između Rusije i Ukrajine odavno nije bila bliža ratu. Nakon što je Moskva podržala ruske separatiste u Lugansku i Donjecku 2014. te anektirala ukrajinski poluotok Krim, sada ponovno prijeti Kijevu. Rasporedila je više od 100.000 vojnika duž granice sa Ukrajinom. Moskva tvrdi da NATO opkoljava Rusiju, te ne želi da Ukrajina pristupi Zapadnom vojnom savezu. Ali NATO odgovara kako je od 20.000 km ruske granice samo 1/16 sa državama članicama alijanse. Ruski zvaničnici su zatražili i da se NATO povuče iz zemalja bivšeg Varšavskog pakta, ali alijansa odgovara da su takvi ultimatumi neprihvatljivi. U ovom izdanju emisije, uz to kako se na rusko raspoređivanje vojske gleda iz Ukrajine, ali i iz baltičkih zemalja, analiziramo vojnu moć ukrajinske i ruske vojske. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima, pogledajmo uvodni prilog.
Viktor je penziju zaradio u rudniku uglja. Kad je riječ o politici, podržava Rusiju. Ali priznaje da je ekonomska situacija sve lošija od kada su separatisti preuzeli kontrolu nad ovom regijom.
Sve je poskupjelo, nafta, voće, meso, komunali. Lokalne vlasti su nam nedavno povisile penzije za 20%, ali neke cijene su veće za 70%. Nema ni radnih mjesta. Mladi mogu naći posao samo ako imaju vezu.
Poskupjele su i neke vrste ribe jer se, od kada je Ukrajina 2017. zabranila trgovinu s onim što opisuje kao okupirane teritorije, većina mora uvoziti iz Rusije. Trgovci moraju plaćati veće troškove prevoza i carinu. Ista je priča s većinom ove robe proizvedenom u Rusiji i Bjelorusiji.
Mnogi su otišli u Rusiju, Ukrajinu i druge zemlje u potrazi za poslom. Ranije sam imala redovne mušterije, više ne.
Iz oblasti pod kontrolom ukrajinske vlade vozovi ovom prugom ne stižu godinama. Ukrajinsku grivnu je 2015. zamijenila ruska rublja. Procjenjuje se da Moskva godišnje troši više od $1 milijardu na pomoć regiji Donjeck i Lugansk, koja je isključena iz međunarodnog bankarskog sistema kad su je zauzeli separatisti. Stanovništvo može poslovati samo s bankama u Rusiji, slati i primati isključivo rublja. Industrija uglja decenijama je bila žila kucavica regije. Većina rudnika je na teritoriji pod kontrolom separatista. U Kijevu kažu da, kako ga nazivaju, ukradeni prirodni resurs Ukrajine pronalazi put na međunarodna tržišta preko Rusije, što Moskva poriče. Stotine preduzeća su od početka sukoba uništene, napuštene ili bankrotirale. 2015. proruski separatisti, a zatim i ukrajinska vlada potpisali su dogovor nazvan Sporazum iz Minska 2, čiji je cilj naći političko rješenje i uspostaviti trajni mir. Ali 7 godina kasnije, nijedan od 13 članova sporazuma nije potpuno proveden. Mnogi ukrajinski političari se žale da je previše u korist separatista, što znači da bi Moskvi dao veću kontrolu nad ukrajinskim pitanjima. Prošle godine ukrajinski predsjednik Volodimir Zelenski rekao je kako želi izmjene sporazuma. Međunarodni posrednici insistiraju da ga obje strane moraju poštivati. Manjak političkog dogovora znači da nema ni ekonomskog oporavka. Ali separatistička vlada tvrdi da ekonomija postepeno jača, u čemu pomažu ruske investicije. U novembru je predsjednik Putin dekretom dozvolio Rusima da legalno kupuju robu proizvedenu ovdje.
Kraj rata i priznanje Narodne republike Donjeck doprinijeli bi razvoju ekonomije. Vojne operacije su naravno utjecale na regiju, da ne spominjemo razaranje poslovne infrastrukture, odlazak stručnjaka, ukrajinsku ekonomsku blokadu koja je uništila naš finansijski sistem. Ali sada taj sistem opet uspostavljamo.
Bez naznaka da će sukob uskoro biti okončan, financijska sigurnost Viktora, njegovih prijatelja i miliona sunarodnjaka ostaje neizvjesna.
Historija napetosti između Rusije i Ukrajine je veoma duga. Te dvije zemlje imaju zajedničke korijene u istočno-slavenskoj državi Kijevska Rus. Upravo zbog toga Vladimir Putin često tvrdi da su Rusi i Ukrajinci jedan narod i dio ruske civilizacije koja uključuje i susjednu Bjelorusiju. Ukrajinci odbacuju te tvrdnje, dok je Bjelorusija pod autoritarnim vodstvom Aleksandra Lukašenka de facto pod kontrolom Moskve. U stvarnosti su se putevi dviju nacija proteklih stoljeća razišli i nastale su dvije kulture, dva jezika i dvije nacije. U 17. stoljeću su veći dijelovi današnje Ukrajine bili inkorporirani u Rusko carstvo, a nakon njegovog raspada 1917. Ukrajina je nakratko bila neovisna, nakon čega ju je Sovjetska Rusija osvojila i ponovno pripojila, a nakon aneksije zemalja Centralne Azije formiran je Sovjetski savez. Staljin je 1945. počeo ciljano naseljavati etničke Ruse širom Ukrajine, kako bi se, prema njegovim riječima, ponovno industrializirala Ukrajina. Godine 1991. raspao se Sovjetski savez, a Moskva je htjela zadržati utjecaj u susjedstvu i stoga je formirala zajednicu neovisnih država. Budimpeštanskim memorandumom iz 1994. dogovoreno je da Kijev preda preostale sovjetske nuklearne bombe Rusiji, a zauzvrat će Moskva poštivati suverenitet i teritorijalni integritet Ukrajine. 2008. godine je tadašnji američki predsjednik George W. Bush nagovijestio da će Ukrajina i Gruzija biti primljene u NATO. Putin je oštro reagovao. Ubrzo je izbio rusko-gruzijski rat i proglašenje samostalnosti Južne Osetije i Abhazije na teritoriji Gruzije. Dok su Rusija i Bjelorusija formirale tijesno savezništvo, u Ukrajini su se borile proruske i proevropske političke snage. Prošla je dvije revolucije, 2005. i 2014. Oba puta je Moskva bila umiješana, jer je željela da na vlasti bude njen kandidat. Nakon revolucije 2014. i svrgavanja proruskog predsjednika Viktora Janukovića, Putin je iskoristio vakum da podrži separatiste u ukrajinskim pokrajinama Donjeck i Lugansk, te da zauzme i anektira Krim zbog njegove strateški važne baze u Sevastopolju, koju je unemljivala ruska mornarica. Sada, vojni analitičari smatraju kako je ruski cilj da vojnim snagama raspoređenim u ovim dijelovima jugoistočne Ukrajine pokušaju probiti kopneni koridor koji bi spojio Lugansk i Donjeck sa gradovima Mariupoljem, Berdijanskom ili Melitopoljem. Time bi se Rusija teritorijalno spojila sa Krimom, budući da ih trenutno povezuje samo most. Idemo sada do Kijeva, gdje se nalazi Oleksij Sorokin, novinar portala Kiev Independent. Oleksij, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, what is the current mood in Ukraine, and how seriously is your government taking the situation with the massing of Russian troops on Ukraine's eastern border?
I think the mood is different between the government and the population. We see that the government is trying to maintain a calm situation. President Zelensky had a public appearance, a video address to the nation saying that please don't panic, everything is calm, everything is okay, we know what's happening. Well, the population is currently frustrated with, especially the comments coming from the US. The US officials say that Russia is going to invade soon. And we know that a lot of people are taking this to heart.
Mm-hmm. Now, could you explain to our viewers, we know that Russia has backed rebels in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Lugansk in 2014. They've also annexed Crimea. What is Russia's current strategic objective? Are they planning to capture a land corridor that would connect mainland Russia with Crimea?
Unfortunately, we don't know what the Kremlin is planning. The general assumption is that they're trying to destabilize Ukraine with the fear of a full-scale invasion. We know that for the past 2 months, there has been over 120,000 Russian troops on Ukrainian borders. That's a very substantial number. That's one of the biggest military buildups since 2014. For Ukraine, we have been fighting Russian aggression for 8 years now, and so the government is prepared for any scenario. We know that the Ukrainian army is more capable right now than it was in 2014, but the biggest question here is what Russia is actually planning. I think the Ukrainian government is assuming that this is some kind of extortion and that Vladimir Putin is trying to gain something from the West. So the government is trying to play it calm, but again, the biggest problem is that we have actually no idea what actually Putin is planning.
Right. Now, are Ukrainians unanimously aware of the threat posed by Russian forces, or do you still have pro-Moscow elements within your government, within the general public?
Well, in government, no. We have one pro-Russian party in parliament, but the general picture is that no other party is willing to hold any sorts of talks with it. There's around 10 to 15% of people who are willing to vote for pro-Russian forces, but they don't have any influence on government. And as we see from the British intelligence, is their main goal is to destabilize the situation right now inside Ukraine.
Now, I'm going through a number of Russian websites in the English language and also in the Balkan languages. I noticed that Russian officials and pro-government analysts and journalists, they have talked about bringing Ukraine back to its quote-unquote historical borders. What exactly does this mean? And is this simply another way of the Kremlin justifying its irredentist aspirations towards Ukraine?
Yes, the problem with the Russian assumption is that they don't see Ukraine as an independent state. We know that the Kremlin thinks very low of Ukraine, Ukrainians, and the Ukrainian government. Basically, the general political stance of Russia is that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people, and that Ukraine gained independence by accident. So their foreign policy is built on the assumption that Ukraine must be either part of Russia or heavily influenced by Russia. And that's why for the past 8 years, and even historically for centuries, Russia has been trying to bring Ukraine back into its sphere of influence. And with the recent buildup, the main idea here is that the Ukrainian government can't cope with this buildup, with this effort of Russia, and that it will have to come to Russian terms.
Right. But what I noticed is that there are two parallel narratives coming from Russian officials. One is that Ukraine historically was a part of Russia and that Putin wants to bring it back under the Russian fold. The second one is that essentially this is an ideological war between Russia and the West, which is being played out or fought on Ukrainian territory. I mean, how do you explain the Russian side asking for NATO to pull its troops out of former Warsaw Pact countries, while at the same time amassing 120,000 soldiers on Ukraine's eastern border?
Well, for the Russian leadership, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a strategic and geopolitical mistake. So for them, Belarus, Ukraine is still a part of this so-called Russian world. Mm-hmm. And for them, they have the sole right to maintain troops or influence in this region. And we know that Russia is very sensitive to troops in former Warsaw Pact countries. And so right now, Russia feels that by amassing over 120,000 troops, it can basically force the West to negotiate and divide spheres of influence in the region. We know that from yesterday's comments by Blinken and by Stoltenberg that NATO and the US are not willing to negotiate further NATO enlargement, that NATO is not willing to back down. And so for Russia right now, it's a pivotal moment because we know that for Putin and Kremlin to back down, they have to have some kind of public win to present it to their domestic viewership. And right now, they're not having it. And so that's the biggest question is, will Russia continue to extort the West and Ukraine to get this public win, or will this actually fade away eventually?
Right. And finally, Germany Many were quite shocked at Germany sitting on the fence and not taking a very firm position in defense of Ukraine. How surprised are you, bearing in mind that Germany is a major EU economy and one of the biggest NATO member states?
Unfortunately, we're not surprised. Germany has a long history of appeasing Russia. Right now, it's been the biggest, the biggest problem in the communication between Ukraine and Germany. Ukrainian-German relations are facing an all-time low. We know that Foreign Minister Kuleba and President Zelensky have made public comments accusing Germany of basically appeasing Russia and playing into Russian interests. The problem here is that Germany is dependent the most on Russian gas. Also, there's a history of German-Russian relations. And we see right now that after Angela Merkel left her post, Germany is losing this leadership role in the European Union and in Europe in general. And we see that Ukraine is getting substantial help from, for example, Britain, from the US, and from other countries. And we understand that Germany is trying to sit this out, and it's hurting both its relationship with Ukraine and standing as a world power, or at least a European powerhouse.
Right. Oleksij, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Poštovani gledaoci, iz Kijeva nam se uključio Oleksij Sorokin, novinar portala Kiev Independent. Sjedinjene Američke Države, Velika Britanija, ali i neke baltičke zemlje intenzivno šalju vojnu pomoć Ukrajini. Uglavnom defanzivno oružje u formi protuoklopnih i protuavionskih raketa Javelin i Stinger. Ipak, velike su razlike između ukrajinske i ruske vojske, kako po broju vojnika, tako i po vojnom budžetu. Idemo sada do Vilniusa, gdje se nalazi Linas Kojala, direktor Centra za istočnoevropske studije. Linas, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, how concerned are you as an observer from the Baltics as you watch the Russian troop build up on Ukraine's eastern border, knowing that similar threats have been addressed at your countries too, coming from the Kremlin over the past couple of months, years in fact?
I think we are all concerned. Of course, geopolitical situation is really tense. Nobody knows what will happen in the next couple of weeks. But on the other hand, of course, the Baltics understand that we are on a bit different level of security in comparison to Ukraine. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland are NATO member states. So I don't think we feel to be directly threatened. But of course, if the war erupts or rather continues, because it has been happening for 8 years in Ukraine, we're talking only about further escalation, that would be detrimental for the regional security. And I expect that the Baltic states would hope that NATO would adequately react and strengthen deterrence on its eastern flank.
Now, there are quite a number of Russian troops based in Belarus, and most Baltic countries, actually, your country borders Belarus. Is this seen as a more immediate threat to you compared to Russia, to mainland Russia?
Yes, that's a big issue. Of course, if Russian troops are permanently stationed in Belarus, that would be detrimental to Lithuania's security, because we have a 700 kilometers almost border with Belarus, and previously there were no permanent Russian troops in that country except small numbers who were based in Belarus. But now we're talking about a lot coming into Belarus for supposedly military exercises, but nobody really knows whether they are going to leave afterwards. So Russian troops stationed in Belarus are both a threat to Ukraine, because it's very close to the capital city of Kiev from Belarus, and to NATO states in the Baltics, because Belarus obviously neighbors them as well.
Right. Now, every time we read about Russia's threats to the Baltics, we hear about the Suwalki corridor, which is a 65-kilometer long strip of territory linking Poland with Lithuania. Many consider it to be NATO's most vulnerable choke point, one that along its eastern flank. Now, in the case of a conflict between Russia and NATO, Russia's military seems to be planning to close the Suwalki corridor and thereby prevent NATO countries from stepping in and helping Baltic states. Is this something that you consider to be a realistic scenario in case of an all-out war between Russia and NATO?
It could be a vulnerability. Of course, the Baltics are always fearful of being cut off from the other NATO states, because our linkages are rather small. But on the other hand, I think we know about this issue for a long time, especially since 2014, when Crimea was annexed, when war in Donbass started. Suwalki corridor was, on top of the agenda of decision makers and on defense planning staff tables. And a lot of steps have been taken since then to strengthen deterrence in the Baltic states by stationing here NATO's enhanced forward presence, strengthening air policing mission, and also obviously analyzing how Suwalki corridor could be defended in case of attack. So I think in comparison to what was before, nowadays Suwalki corridor is much better understood as an issue and much better prepared to be defended if needed.
Now, do you see Ukraine as being sort of an ideological battlefield between Russia and NATO, or is it more about Putin's plans to annex irredentist aspirations to annex parts of Ukraine that he considers to be quote-unquote historic Russia?
I think Russia sees that Ukraine is moving out of Russia's sphere of influence. We've seen that the Ukrainian constitution implemented a strategic goal of joining both the European Union and NATO in the long-term future, of course. We've seen that the Ukrainian language is growing in importance in Ukraine and pushing Russian language aside. We've seen that even, political rivals are urging for the same geostrategic goal of Ukraine joining the Western community. And I think that concerns Kremlin, and it wants to stop these negative processes from happening. But unfortunately for us and for Ukraine, of course, basically the only tool that Russia currently has is military power, obviously, besides the energy that it uses as well. But military power is not, a long-term tool to change the strategy of Ukraine. So I think it's not a battleground. It's rather an attempt from Russia to stop Ukraine from making its own sovereign choice of seeking membership in the Western community, rather sticking around with Russia.
Right. But do you think that whatever happens in Ukraine will have repercussions on Europe's complete security architecture? I mean, many are drawing parallels between what happens in Ukraine and what happens in the Western Balkans, more precisely in Bosnia.
Sure, it has a huge impact on the whole security architecture in Europe. I think one of the goals of the Baltic states is to be involved in any talks about, adaptation of the European security architecture to the current circumstances. It shouldn't be changed significantly in the sense that every country that wishes to join NATO, that wishes to join the European Union, should have that right. It's a sovereign right for every European country, Ukraine included. Nobody can neglect that fact. And also there could be no talk about implementing Russia's demand of, moving back to 1997, when NATO was not in the Baltic states yet, when NATO was much less involved in Central and Eastern Europe, because it was decisions taken by, again, sovereign states, democratic states, who sought membership in NATO to strengthen their own security. So there's no talk about coming back to that, but of course there could be discussions about, arm control, about military exercises and their transparency, as well as the legal framework on military exercises. So many things could be discussed, but not the ones that Russia put out in public as demands and as an ultimatum, in a sense.
Right. What is interesting is that Baltic states have been sending lethal weapons to the Ukrainian military, mostly javelins and stingers. Were you expecting more? I mean, at the same time, Germany is still sitting on the fence. It only decided to send about 5,000 helmets to Ukraine. Were you expecting more from West European states when it comes to militarily aiding Ukraine?
Well, I think quite a lot of states are already helping Ukraine. As you mentioned, the Baltics, Poland, the United Kingdom, the US. I think that's a significant group of countries.
Right, but not Germany, France, Italy, Spain, or any other West European NATO member state.
Sure. So on a strategic level, I think there is a common position in the Western community on how to support Ukraine. On a tactical level, whether guns should be given to Ukraine and armaments as well, there are some divergences, and I think they are both dependent on historic circumstances as well as on political circumstances. As we've seen just recently, the new government was formed in Germany, and there are some, opinions or diverging opinions among the parties in the ruling coalition on how to deal with these circumstances. So there are some disagreements, there are some issues which are not yet a consensus in the Western community, but I think that's a fact in any crisis, because we have 30 countries in NATO, 27 EU member states, and it's not always easy to reach a consensus that fits everyone.
Right. Linas, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Situacija ostaje napeta. Maratonski pregovori Sjedinjenih Američkih Država i Rusije nisu za sad urodili plodom. Rusija i dalje zahtjeva nerealne ustupke, a SAD ne popušta. Stari rivali iz hladnog rata trenutno su najbliži stvarnom sukobu još od pada Berlinskog zida. A šta se desi u Ukrajini imat će posljedice na cjelokupnu europsku sigurnosnu arhitekturu. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnje.